My name is David Lonsdale, and I'm involved very much with the power of the word. But I've been asked this morning, first of all, I've been asked to introduce David Jasper to you, who is our first speaker. So it's my pleasure to introduce him. He's currently Emeritus Professor at the University of Glasgow. I don't want this to be a long introduction, but I just want to pay tribute to him as an educator in literature, religion, and theology, not in separate silos, but in relationship with each other. So his books include educational resources, valuable for both students and teachers. For example, Readers in Literature, Religion and Theology, collection of writings from the stars of the subjects, and as co-editor, the Oxford Handbook of English Literature and Theology. David also founded the Conference on Literature and Religion at Durham University in 1980, and that conference organized international academic meetings every other year for several years. He was founding editor of the journal, Literature and Theology, which is now in its 38th year and still going strong. And at Glasgow University, he established and led the Centre for the Study of Theology and the Arts, offering both taught and research degrees. So today I suggest we welcome David not only as a scholar, a thinker and a writer, but also as an outstanding educator, who besides teaching and presumably doing his marking, also played a major role in establishing lasting structures and resources by which other people, present and future, can learn and grow and flourish. So David, a warm welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for your welcome, and thank you for coming here this morning. What I want to say might be, I hope, deliberately somewhat provocative in parts, and if we have time for discussion and questions and so on afterwards, I'm quite happy for you to come back at me and we'll have a go at them, and that's the way we proceed and learn, I hope. To catch the conscience of the king, Literature's address to theology. Hamlet seeks to catch the conscience of Claudius the king by subjecting him to a play within the play of Shakespeare's revenge tragedy. The performance of the mousetrap is a game, a rough copy of the real thing, in which Hamlet says, I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father. But its effect is devastating, as the king gets up, frighted with false fire. Literature has always been, at its best, a barb to prick the conscience, or perhaps to worry the tidy theological mind and spirit. And as we shall see more. Theology and literature have never been comfortable bedfellows. For though each thrive on the feasts of language, their natures are quite different. Yet they share some of the same preoccupations. In one of the last tales of Karen Blixen, a lady asks a cardinal, "Are you sure that it is God whom you serve?" The cardinal looked up, met her eyes, and smiled very gently. That, he said, that, madam, is a risk which the artists and priests of the world have to run. But there are times when that risk becomes intolerable. The tragedy of Hamlet, it may be said, arises from the absence of a belief in the doctrine of purgatory, abolished in Article 22 of the Church of England's newly minted 39 Articles of Religion of 1571. The brilliance of the doctrine of purgatory, whatever its topographical implausibility, its scriptural belatedness, and its proneness to cynical belief, all these words of Stephen Greenblatt, lay both in its institutional control over ineradicable folk beliefs and its engagement with intimate private feelings. The doctrine of purgatory was a key element in the medieval art of memory, which was far more imaginative, creative, and engaged than the modern, rather dull and mechanical sets of memory. At its most creative, memory thrives on paradox, as when the Israelites in the book of Deuteronomy are instructed to remember to forget the Amalekites. You shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget, Deuteronomy 25:19. Do not forget to forget. At key moments in human experience, just when it is needed most, it seems, theology falters, leaves us abandoned, and we are left only with the space of literature and its infinite toleration of irresolution, along with its strict grammatical requirements. The spirit of those early conferences on religion and literature in Durham that we've heard of, which began in the early 1980s, arose, I think, from the inarticulacy of theology after the death camps and Auschwitz and after the global conflict of World War II. Despite Adorno, to whom we shall return in due course, only the poets remained to speak the impossible. The grammar of theology fell apart, as when, in the words of the philosopher D.Z. Phillips, who attended our first conference in 1982, the most common infringements of grammar come about by trying to sever a concept from the conditions of its application. Only poetry could address the supreme negativity of Auschwitz in a challenge which theology found it hard to rise to. Do not forget to forget. The Christian priest and theologian Ulrich Seiler, who was at those early conferences, a man whose Jewish family all died in the death camps, he thinks, wrote a devastating passage on the camp guards, which, hard though it is, I'm going to quote at some length. For it is from here, the point of utter negation, that alone an articulate theology can begin shaped again. Along with the poets Celan, Bizel, Levi, and others. Here's Ulrich Simon, a devout Anglican priest of the Camp Guards. Not for them are the strains of the Requiem Aeterna. Not for them the absolution from sin and the enjoyment of bliss. Theirs is no mystery of transformation. As the wires still hang aimlessly in the air, and as the tracks are overgrown which lead through the ridiculous battlement to the long platforms where no more trains arrive to unload children from trucks, so they who have caused the misery recede like ghosts in the thin air. No archangel descends to collect their souls in the worldwide offering of sacrifice and homage. In the darkness, the shades blend with the blackness until complete indifference engulfs them. May they never rise again. Poetry takes us to that point when speech is truly impossible. And only when we can hear and enact the impossibility, letting the unsayable remain unsaid, can we too dare to whisper, Tetelestai, it is finished. In his late work, An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent, John Henry Newman writes of the ilative sense. Now that's a term which he had been groping for in his mind in much earlier writing in 1830, when he said, practical matters cannot be defended by argument or explained on paper, but are determined by the dictates of an internal, unproducible sense whose reasonings cannot be expressed in a formula. Newman was to use the ilative sense to lead him and us to a position of religious certitude. But, dare I say this here, he was never strictly a theologian. And despite the many volumes written on him, Newman, I suggest, has never really been taken seriously within the creative impasse of literature and theology. In his lectures on the prophetical office of the church, written in 1837 in his Anglican days, Newman resorts at key moments to what he calls the language of the imagination, to resolve his word, to resolve the reasonings of the church's theology. They are moments that are necessary but always uneasy. For such language, which John Coulson was later to call fiduciary, in which understanding religious language is a function of understanding poetic language, arises in Newman as both necessary and uncomfortable. For it originates for him from, above all, the writings of the Romantic poet S.T. Coleridge, of whom Newman wrote in the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, that he provided the philosophical basis for all inquiring minds. Yet, at the same time, he indulged a liberty of speculation which no Christian can tolerate. In short, like all true poets, we can't do with them and we can't do without them. At the end of his long life, Newman denied that he had ever read Coleridge. The 0 point of the impossible. The moment when Claudius rushes from the hall, away from the play, with the cry, "Give me some light." Literature truly begins to bite when articulate theology simply becomes impossible and needs to be reborn. Picking up then from Ulrich Simon, where we left him with the camp guards in Auschwitz, at this moment of 0 hope, yet the poet sings in Paul Celan's psalm, "No one molds us again out of the earth and clay. No one conjures our dust, no one. Praise be your name, no one. For your sake, we shall flower towards you." Even the beauty of the poem can be terrible, a challenge to the moral conscience, or perhaps an affirmation of beauty even in the depths of hell. For the camp guards, there is no salvation there. Perhaps Celan's greatest poem, Todesfuge, Death Fugue, even in an English translation, has a beauty which mirrors in language the musical beauty of J.S. Bach's Art of Fugue, though the words themselves are terrible. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at sundown, we drink it at noon, in the morning, we drink it at night, we drink and we drink it. In such terrible beauty, where theology for a moment is silenced, the movement of total negation eliminates the given meaning of God as God and is known only as no one, the unknown, the unsayable, the unknowable, the unnameable. A negative theology indeed. But what of the reader, us, negotiating this terrible beauty of the poetic? Long ago in phenomenology, Wolfgang Iser's theory of art emphasized the fragile, unstable role of the reader before the text that endlessly plays serious games, challenging the reader's imagination, wrong-footing the reader, catching the conscience. There is, of course, no such thing as the perfect reader. That would spell the end of literature. As the real literature, who is all of us, imagines the unwritten part of the text. As Virginia Woolf said of Jane Austen, she is thus a mistress of much deeper emotion than appears on the surface. She stimulates us to supply what is not there. It doesn't take a philosopher like Wittgenstein to tell us that the text is made up of 2 parts, the written and the unwritten. And the unwritten part is the more important one. Take the example of Dostoevsky's short novella, A Gentle Spirit. The narrator's wife, a gentle young seamstress, has just committed suicide. As he tells the story of their meeting and marriage, the reading becomes increasingly uncomfortable as the narrator's character as a controlling husband becomes ever clearer to the reader, or perhaps not. The reader has a moral choice facing this story of what Dostoevsky calls kosmos, or spiritual stagnation in a material world. This portrait of one of the nastiest characters you could ever meet, even by Dostoevsky's standards, is still capable of pulling the wool over the reader's eyes. Or perhaps the reader does it to him or herself. Never ever, as readers, let us underestimate our capacity to be surprised by sin, our own sin, as the poet Milton was perfectly well aware. I remember once talking with a student about military leaders in Shakespeare's plays. Who would you follow? Well, we agreed that we would feel much safer with Coriolanus than Henry V. But what does that say about us? But to return to Dostoevsky for a moment and the familiar ending of Crime and Punishment. It's a supreme example of Wittgenstein's point. Raskolnikov's story takes him to the prison camp with Sonia and his reading of the gospel story of the raising of Lazarus. Christian theology is invited to have its say and bring things to a fine conclusion. But it doesn't. Raskolnikov and Sonia's realization merely prompts another, as yet untold story, with perhaps its own dilemmas and challenges in a new and hitherto unknown reality. That might be the subject of a new story. Our present story is ended. That's what literature does. It opens up the possibilities of as yet unseen worlds. One theme of this lecture might be the weakness of the reader, the morally necessary weakness of the reader. Theology, all too often, affirms in creedal statements and systematic treatises. On the whole, though not always, and they probably will often deny it, theologians are happier in the company of philosophers rather than the more disturbing poets and writers of stories. Ponder with me for a moment some thoughts of Maurice Blanchot on literature more generally, and then specifically Franz Kafka in Blanchot's book, The Space of Literature. First, the more general. A book, even a fragmentary one, has a center which attracts it. This center is not fixed, but is displaced by the pressure of the book and circumstances of its composition. Yet it is also a fixed center, which, if it is genuine, displaces itself, while remaining the same and becoming always more central, more hidden, more uncertain, more imperious. Not easy to get your mind around that, but still. The second from Blanchot, and I think more importantly, Kafka's passion, writes Blanchot, is purely literary. But it is not always only literary. Salvation is an enormous preoccupation with him, all the stronger because it is hopeless, and all the more hopeless because it is totally uncompromising. To be sure, this preoccupation is expressed with surprising constancy through literature, and for quite a long time, it does not even differentiate itself from literature. Then, for some time, it continues to be expressed in literature, but it no longer blends with literature. It tends rather to use literature, what theology tends to do if we let it. So this illustrates, I hope, beautifully my preoccupation in the lecture. Actually, it's not literature, it's theology, which one cannot do without. And yet, at the same time, we can't do with it. But the passion is with literature, with Kafka's haunting novels and stories, which both construct and demolish theology. Until in the end, though not in Kafka, theology tends to take over. And we end up merely with second-rate literature, from Charlotte Young to Graham Greene, in which theology presumptuously occupies that space of literature, and it shouldn't. And true poetry will never tolerate that occupation. At the end of Paradise Lost, as David Jasper once wisely said, God is justified in a way that might have surprised even him. The great poets can even wrong-foot the Almighty. Though perhaps a more serious way of putting this is that, to begin with at least, all theological affirmations must be negated in the recognition that the mystery of God cannot be penetrated by any human form of knowledge or vision, and the greatest task of poetry is, in Heidegger's phrase, to let the unsayable be unsaid. As my old friend, the theologian Tom Altizer, and I see a few eyebrows being raised here, but that's as it may be. Tom Altizer once said, "The God who reveals their own being speaks out of the heart of darkness." Or for the poet, the moment of silence that is the end of all poetry. For the real ending of speech is the dawning of resurrection, and the final ending of speech is the dawning of a totally present actuality. But let's take a step or two back from this outrageous statement and return to the more mundane world of hermeneutics or textual interpretation. The nature of the complex exchanges between texts and their readers has been one of my life's obsessions. But more recently, it has suffered another turn for me, since I've been spending a great deal of time in the last few years in the world of medieval literature and manuscripts. It was once wisely said that medieval texts just look at you, defying all the niceties of more recent texts, whom we ascribe to the authority of authors. We speak of Dostoevsky's novels or Shakespeare's plays, giving the author some kind of supreme status, and a fixed form which medieval texts neither possess nor even aspire to. There's actually no fixed form of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, only numerous manuscripts, all of them different from the others. The late medieval poem, which we know as the Lay Folks Mass Book, which I've spent a great deal of time with in the last few years, makes no claims whatsoever to poetic greatness and is cheerfully adaptable to different circumstances, the cathedral, the parish church, the monastic community, and so on. Acknowledging the place of theology while stubbornly refusing its toxic dominance. The text sits and looks at you stubbornly and gets on with its job of creating a necessary world. Actually, there's a great deal to be learned from this, in as much as literature and poetry, even in its humbler forms, sits very loosely to the potential toxicity of theology and its tendency to dominate. But let me return to Hamlet for a moment and try to refine that last statement. I suggested that Shakespeare's revenge tragedy is an extended meditation on the abolition in the Anglican 39 Articles of Religion of the late medieval doctrine of purgatory, in those Anglican articles denounced as a Romish doctrine, a fond thing vainly invented and grounded upon no warranty of Scripture, but rather repugnant to the word of God. Actually, at its root, the doctrine of purgatory, which is not stated in the Church as a doctrine until the 12th century, is a brilliant engagement with both folk belief and private devotions regarding the departed. Its fault really lay in its cynical abuse as a means of institutional control, while its poetry, finally, is reworked by Shakespeare. Thus, how often are Horatio's final words over the dying, actually by now dead, Hamlet restated, not least by King Charles III after the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. While we forget that Shakespeare, extraordinary in England at the turn of the 17th century, 1600, 1601, is actually drawing on words from the Latin in Paradisum, from the Requiem Mass of the ancient Latin liturgy in Anglican England. Indeed, it would seem to me that Hamlet, in the last moments of his life, the ghosts finally laid to rest, would explain everything, but the poetry leaves it unsaid. Had I but time, as this fell sergeant's death is strict in his arrest, oh, I could tell you, but let it be. But let it be. The silence is everything. In letting the silence speak, the poetry maintains a sense of compassion when theology becomes truly inarticulate, in what Ulrich Simon once called the stale religious positions of our time. Or to put this another way, the vision remains when dogma becomes stale or even toxic, though the moral is never easy. At the end of André Schwartzbart's Holocaust novel, The Last of the Just, the central character, the last of the just, is traveling to Auschwitz in a boxcar with a group of orphaned and doomed children. He tells them stories of heaven. There, children can find their parents and everyone is happy because the country we're going to That's our kingdom, you know. There the sun never sets, and you may eat anything you can think of. There an eternal joy will crown your heads, cheerfulness and gaiety will come and greet you, and all the pains and moans will run away. An older woman in the boxcar chides the speaker for what he says with hate in her voice. For you know what's going to happen in the death camp. Madam, he replied, there is no room for truth here. Then what is there room for, she began. And taking a closer look at Ernie, registering all the slightest details of his face, she murmured softly, then you don't believe what you're saying at all? Not at all? That willing suspension of disbelief is never easy. But sometimes, perhaps, it's all we have to make things bearable. And what then of truth? It's said by Richard Holloway that once he read this passage to the new atheist Richard Dawkins and asked Richard Dawkins what he would have said to the children in the boxcar. Dawkins replied, I would have told them of heaven as well. Belief and unbelief, truth and untruth, these are difficult terms. And sometimes the best we can do is let it be, like Hamlet. But now I want to change the tone a little and address two of the great writers in the English language of the modern age, both of them different in their different ways, tangling with the Bible as one of the great texts of literature and theology. The first is certainly one of the greatest novelists in the English language, Henry James, seen through the fine lens of two of his last novels, The Wings of the Dove of 1902 and The Golden Bowl of 1904. They have in common titles drawn from biblical literature, each providing the spring for their respective books. The Wings of the Dove first, for which we must go back to Psalm 55, verses 4 to 7. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Truly, I would fly away. I would lodge in the wilderness. Henry James is never easy, and the reader needs to meditate upon this heartfelt passage from the Psalms before entering the world of the rich and dying Millie Teal and the triangle with her of the impoverished fortune-hunting Kate Croy and the journalist Merton Densher. James, it might be said, was a deeply biblical writer, as his complex essays on human consciousness play upon the biblical theme suggested by the title. Nothing is on the surface, as the reader is drawn in the consciousness of each character, and each character is rendered through the consciousness of others. In his later preface to The Wings of the Dove, James describes Millie's situation as renderable through the scheming intelligence of Kate, a complex tragedy which the formulas of theology cannot touch. James, it might be said, is the Homer of Eric Auerbach's familiar essay, Odysseus' Scar, in whose writing there is no surface, but only the murky depths of human consciousness which carry the weight of all morality. As James put it in his preface, the building up of Kate Croy's consciousness to the capacity for the load little by little to be laid upon it was, by way of example, to have been a matter of as many hundred close-packed bricks as there are actually poor dozens. Poets deal in complexity and the complex structures of character. And at the very end of the novel, you will remember, Merton Densher returns to the image of Millie as the dove as she stretches out her wings in death. Kate and Merton agree to marry, but we shall never be as we were. Paradise Lost. In the end, I suggest James is one of the most religious and least theological of writers. If that is true of Thomas Hardy, it is far more so, though little acknowledged, of Henry James. For if Hamlet, in the exercise of free will, can say that there is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will, how much more is this not also true of the characters of James in The Portrait of a Lady, The Wings of a Dove, and finally his last and, in my view, greatest novel, The Golden Bowl? Once again, the key is in the title from Ecclesiastes 12, 6-7. Before the silver cord is snapped and the golden bowl is broken, and the pitcher is broken at the fountain, and the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, all is vanity. The golden bowl, James described as a venture of one's intelligence, a claustrophobic history of 4 characters and their consciousness, limiting the point of view so that the reader works as hard as any of them in deciphering character and movement. And at the center, that biblical image, the multiple symbolism of the flawed, beautiful golden bowl. Do we finally see anything as in the final words? See, I see nothing but you. And the truth of it had, with this force, after a moment, so strangely lighted his eyes, that as for pity and dread of them, she buried her own in his breast. This is too cold and too complex a world for theology properly to flourish in. It has not the horrors of the death camp, though in its way, the world of James is just as dark and mysterious. A brave, saintly person, of whom there are a few in James's fiction, might begin again, but only with a negative theology, born not of the descent of the dove, but the descent into hell. In such a theology, perhaps, and I go back to Tom Altizer, darkness is finally only the immediate or initial expression of light. Or rather, darkness is most dark when it is envisioned as having come to an end, and that end is identical with the total triumph of light. But an apocalyptic light can never truly appear apart from a comprehensive vision of the end of darkness. Strange language, perhaps, to use of Henry James, but far less so in the fiction of my second modern writer, in which the surname becomes the Christian name, James Joyce. Joyce, in a different way, does not make it easy for the reader either. He's immersed in theology and beyond theology. Finnegan's Wake is perhaps the most scriptural of any novel written, and it finds its heart in the pubs of Dublin, and heard read aloud in a Dublin accent makes much better sense. The first part of the Wake to be written was actually the conclusion of Book 2, Chapter 3, and begins almost in the very middle of the book, with the resumption of interrupted bar talk. So you were saying, boys, anyhow, what? Its meanderings draw upon Irish folk myths and history, Arthurian legends, but far more deeply on the Roman Catholic liturgy for Holy Saturday. It's a text somewhere between orality and literacy. Joyce's language in the Wake provides that space of literature that enacts a scatological, devout liturgy, drawing upon the sacramental body, even and especially in its death. Here is the Mass, enacted as an absolute negation or kenosis, a self-emptying that is only finally consummated in the last pages of the book, in the resurrection of Anna Livia Plurabelle, a resurrection that absorbs the power of the Godhead and finally and at last recovers the feminine with a creative sensuality of word that Christian theology itself, in its long tradition, has actually systematically denied and eliminated in the insistent cult of Mary's perpetual virginity. And the final words of the book lead us straight back to the opening sentence. Same is actually true of St. Mark's Gospel. The end, away, alone, along, alast, along the beginning, river run past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of veil. There's one enduring story in the Wake, the repeated story of the fall, reenacted around the crime-haunted Earwicker family. And from this matrix, theology emerges, but only in its own way. Jacques Derrida once called Joyce the most Hegelian of writers, and it was Hegel, we must recall, not Nietzsche, who first referred in philosophy to the death of God. And although theology and the liturgy of the Church saturate Joyce's two greatest books, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, their language simply is of and in itself, in its endless playfulness, creativity, and circularities. To read it ultimately is to participate in the divine joy of creation within the Church, when the Church and its theology have been rendered silence, though their echoes are everywhere. That space of literature that in the end tolerates no masters. So as I begin to draw towards my conclusion, I turn to one of the greatest, most difficult, and most generally neglected of modern English poets, the late Geoffrey Hill. One of his books of essays is entitled In the Enemy's Country, Words, Contexture, and Other Circumstances of Language. To find its origin, we must go back to a time in which we began, or slightly later than Shakespeare, to William Davenant's unfinished romantic epic Gondibert of 1651, in which the author's preface begins with the conceit of the vast field of learning, where the learned lie maliciously in ambush, and where one must travail as through the enemy's country. In fact, Davenant himself probably took this phrase from Thomas Nash, his 1593 attack on the Cambridge pedant Gabriel Harvey, strange news of the intercepting of certain letters, where Nash asks his friend Apis Lapsis, Mr. Beeston, to safe conduct this book through the enemy's country. And high among the enemies referred to by Nash are theologians particularly of a puritanical kind. Hill is often a deeply religious poet. He once wrote in a poem, "I confess to the priest in me," and was married indeed to an Anglican clergywoman. But he writes like a true poet on the edge of words where theology has already spluttered into incoherence. His troubling, uncomfortable verse forays into the enemy's country, offering moments of recognition, echoes of the familiar, followed by something shocking, nothing ever quite holding together. But the unease is the provocation to thought and reflection. So listen, just listen, and it will not be comfortable, to the second of the sonnets entitled Annunciations in Geoffrey Hill's collection King Log of 1968. O love, subject of the mere diurnal grind, forever being pledged to be redeemed, expose yourself for charity. Be assured, the body is but husk and excrement. Enter these deaths according to the law, O visited women, possessed sons. Foreign lusts infringe our restraints. The changeable soldiery have their goings out and comings in, dying in abundance. Choicest beasts suffuse the gutters with their colourful blood. Our God scatters corruption. Priests, martyrs, parade to this imperious theme. O love, you know what pains succeed. Be vigilant, strive to recognize the damned among your friends. I'm not going to say more about this poem, for it's Hill's relentless honesty that I most deeply admire. Nothing for him is ever simple as he seeks articulation in the enemy's country. Okay, I could have chosen an easier theme. I've spoken of those moments when theology is silent or perhaps silenced, and all that remains is the poet speaking when speech has been rendered impossible. My own history in the field of literature and theology began with a sense of theology when theology seemed impossible. Not through disbelief, but something much harder, such as when Ulrich Simon was confronted by the hell of Auschwitz. Going back to our series of conferences that began in 1982 in the University of Durham, I don't think that we succeeded in what we set out to do, at least in any institutional sense within the university system. I very much doubt if we could have done it. Perhaps in its wild prayer of longing, what we sought to articulate was impossible, which is precisely the moment when the poet speaks. Is Hamlet then simply mad, the matter being merely words, words, words? The ghost himself counsels Hamlet to leave his mother to heaven and her conscience. But howsoever thou pursues this act, taint not thy mind, nor let thy soul contrive against thy mother aught. Leave her to heaven, and to those thorns that in her bosom lodge, to prick and sting her. Ah, but for Claudius, there's the mousetrap, the play wherein to catch the conscience of the king. But is that it? Is that the only purpose of poetry and literature? And then after Auschwitz, did not Theodore Adorno tell us that poets should keep silence, or at best, that to write at all was mere barbarism? And yet Adorno also read Celan and the poets who spoke of the moments of reprieve, or perhaps even more puzzling for us, the camp survivor Imre Kertész, who wrote at the end of his autobiographical novel, Fateless. He's a camp survivor as a young boy. For even there, next to the chimneys, in the intervals between the torments, there was something that resembled happiness. Everyone asks only about the hardships and the atrocities, whereas for me, it is that experience which will remain in the memory. Yes, the next time I'm asked, I ought to speak about that, the happiness of the concentration camps. I was once told that I couldn't publish this extract in an essay as it would not be understood and might cause offence, but I'm saying it here to you. It's indeed hard for us to understand at any level, harder, that's the point, than Ulrich Simon's initial damning of the guards, to speak of the happiness of the camps. But what right have we to deny that as non-survivors? It's hard for us to understand at any level, but I'm glad it's there. And perhaps for those who were there in the camps, it makes the suffering seem bearable while leaving the unsayable yet unsaid. That's what poetry does. Something far more difficult than just saying the unsayable. As Rowan Williams writes of in his Gifford lectures, The Eds of Words, we go beyond that. It's leaving the unsayable unsaid. Think of the happiness, the beauty in Celan's psalm. And nothing we were, are, shall remain flowering, the nothing, the no one's rose. At the end of his theology of Auschwitz, Ulrich Simon wrote that to rebuild a theology after the death camps, and we might say in our own time now, after Gaza and Syria, the old institutions by themselves are powerless to effect this end. But the spiritual forces that once built these institutions are alive today. The language, the vocabulary needs to be remade. For the poet and the writer is indeed the true maker after God. And in Coleridge's words, the primary imagination, I remind you, is the living power and prime agent of all human perception and a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. A divine act. And thus, as we stumble forwards, our consciences pained and caught, new words are found for us, and an old vocabulary finds new meanings in liturgical renewal, in the space of literature that precedes all theology. And so, in the words of the poet, lamentations, confessions, petitions, intercessions, thanksgivings, and jubilations create the forms which transform the camp of enslavement into the walls and towers of the kingdom of God. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liam, for that very inspiring and stimulating lecture. We'll have to just take a minute now, and if anyone wants to kind of, if you want to stretch your legs and get up and walk about for 30 seconds or so, you're very welcome to do so, and then we'll have some questions. Yeah.
Poczekaj chwilę.
Okay. We're in danger of time and taking time out of the topic, which is work longer. So we have just about 5 minutes for questions to David on this lecture. Questions or comments and observations. Okay.
My great thanks to David for having this lecture. My question, of course, is going to be quite difficult because I'm going to be a thorn in the heart. I try to think. So let's take the example that we have a theology guided by literature, or even dominated by literature, or even we abolish theology. Let literature take the reins. Would it reinvigorate moribund theology? Would it give theology the ability to tackle Gaza, Syria, Ukraine, Trumpism, fascism? I mean, it's slightly facetious, but would it reinvigorate a theology which perhaps has got lost somewhere on the way? I think we're hinting at that, but what would the new theology be?
Well, I don't think I'm in a position to give a kind of clear answer to that. That's the next stage. That's the next few chapters. I think what I'm wanting to try and establish, or what I was wanting to try and establish today, was the distinction between literature and theology. They're not the same thing. And it's very easy for us to get imbalanced, either for theology to dominate literature and simply excavate literature for its own purposes, assuming that its language, the language of the atonement, the language of the incarnation, whatever it might be, is somehow or other intact and resident in the literature. Or, equally, the danger, which possibly I can be accused of today, is the dominance of literature, where you say we don't need theology anymore, all we need are the poets. And I'm not saying either of those two things. I'm saying that the two need each other, and that theology needs, as it were, the correction, the creativity of poetry, because poets deal with words. Poets deal with words. They make words. They're makers, as we call them in Scotland. And so poets, and someone like Coleridge, whom I've repeatedly referred to in the lecture, was a great coiner of words. The word existential was invented by Coleridge. Words that we now take for granted, he made up, and they become meaningful. Theology, as it were, carefully and properly within institutions, churches, and so on and so forth, evaluates words and brings them into articulate correspondence with one another. So we can speak of doctrines, quite rightly, and so on and so forth. But they also are living things. They're comprised of metaphors and so on and so forth. And so they continually need to be interrogated, unpacked. And generally speaking, those moments become most acute, as in the moment of Ulrich Simons confronting Auschwitz, in those profound moments when we have to stop and say, actually, the theology that we quite properly celebrate, use, employ in our liturgy above all as an African, which is a kind of enacted systematic theology when all's said and done. Actually, they do need to be revisited, and the elements within them need to be unpacked, because they just are not fit for this particular purpose. Now, I think that in certain ways, and that's why I wanted to make the contrast, it happens in those radical moments where a devout Anglican priest, Ulrich Simon, says, may they never rise again. He said, I can't, you know, and that's where our conferences began, I think, with that kind of frustration. It wasn't disbelief. It wasn't that we were abandoning the task of theology. It was that theology needed reinvigorating, needed revisiting and reconstituting within new context. That's what's happening in Henry James's novels in a quite different way. Those claustrophobic interactions between 3 or 4 people are also moments profoundly religious, that provoke, need to, and if theology fails to respond to those moments, if theology fails to listen to those moments, then it will become ossified and actually ultimately irrelevant. And we see that happening all the time. And I speak that myself as a theologian, as a priest, as someone who not only values but needs theology, recognizes it, we can't do without it, and we can't sometimes do with it as it's presented to us, as we know, because it just doesn't work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm sorry, but in order to allow time to for everyone to get a cup of tea, coffee, and so on, we need to stop now. Perhaps if you have a question or a comment, you could approach David sometime during the day and put it to him. But that's where we are.
Not only in the afternoon, there'll be discussion, and so we'll receive questions as well in the afternoon after the 3 lectures. So there will be time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's very enjoyable.
And Francesco, no, that's why I was reading about that's the only point which I had think about. Are you working? Not, yeah. But I'm a solution here, okay. Working management, actually working a lot of people. Yes, you're doing new buildings for the market. I worked in the commercial sector, I got that usually use together. So anyway, I need to if I'm fresh, Monday to Friday, I'm involved in all sorts of things, like, well, personally, I'm not that attractive, but, you know, like contract,